During the course of the 1950s and 1960s, I want to point towards a new trajectory for American foreign policy, especially the formation of a type of liberal internationalism with a capital L, liberal, under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. This includes JFK's foreign policy legacy, thinking about the cases of 1961 to 1964 in Brazil, 1963 in Iraq, and 1963 in the Republic of Vietnam. When the president of Brazil resigned in August 1961, he was lawfully succeeded by João Belchior Marques Goulart, or João Goulart, who's pictured here shaking JFK's hand. João Goulart was a prominent proponent of democratic rights, but also the legalization of the Communist Party and economic land reforms. Nonetheless, the U.S. government insisted that he impose a program of economic austerity on the country. Brazil is an enormous economy, the world's fifth largest quite often. Depending on the decade, it moves back and forth, but a substantial economy. And the United States government implemented a plan with the code name of Operation Brother Sam for the destabilization of João Goulart's government by cutting off aid to the Brazilian government, providing aid to state governments of Brazil who opposed the new president, and encouraging senior Brazilian military officers to seize power and back Chief Army General Humberto de Alencar Castelo Branco, also known as Branco, the founder of the Branco regime and a coup leader. General Branco, after JFK had already been assassinated, led in April 1964 the overthrow of the constitutional government of João Goulart and was installed as the first president of a brutal military regime, immediately declaring a state of siege and arresting more than 50,000 political opponents that he proclaimed political opponents on trumped-up evidence, torture, imprisoned them, arresting more, and assassinating thousands of others, while the U.S. government expressed approval and reinstituted aid and investment in the country. In the case of Iraq, several sources, notably Said Obrubish, have alleged that the February 1963 coup d'etat that resulted in the formation of the Ba'athist government of Iraq was masterminded by the CIA. However, and this is very important, as of yet, no declassified U.S. documents have verified this allegation. So, nonetheless, there is this Ba'athist form that overthrew Qasim on February 8, 1963, in potentially some sort of collaboration with American support or the support of the American Secret Service. The U.S. offered material support to the new Ba'athist government, however. This much is confirmed. After the coup, despite a really bloody anti-communist purge that were committed especially in northern regions of Iraq, and then finally a purge against Kurdish rebels and civilians. Because of this, Nathan Centino asserts that although the United States did not initiate the 14 Ramadan coup, the coup that brought the Baathists to power and Saddam Hussein to power, at best it condoned it, and at worst it contributed to the violence that followed. In fact, the United States sold the Iraqi government weapons all the way up through the direct conflict with Iran and backed the Baathists during their series of purges against ethnic Kurds in the north. Now, there's been a great deal of academic discussion regarding the allegations of CIA collaboration. All of this distracts from the fact that the U.S. government simply put the stamp of approval on the Ba'athist regime until relatively recently. The criticism of Saddam Hussein was really much an afterthought of the 1990s, not so much a thought of the 1960s through the 1980s. Now, in the case of Vietnam, although we'll focus on the Republic of Vietnam in much more detail, although the United States was allied with the Republic of Vietnam, also known sometimes as South Vietnam informally. In this class, I'll refer to the Republic of Vietnam. The United States was very critical of the leader No Dinh Diem. And although the United States was a clear ally, the Kennedy administration had grown increasingly frustrated with President No Dinh Diem's corruption and repressive rule. In light of Diem's refusal to adopt reforms, American officials debated whether or not they should offer to support rivals of his in an effort to replace him. These debates resulted in a dispatch of Cable 243 on August 24th of 1963, which instructed U.S. Ambassador to the Republic, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the same individual who had held JFK's senatorial seat in Massachusetts before JFK had held it, to examine all possible alternatives to No Dinh Diem's leadership and to make detailed plans as to how we might bring about Diem's replacement should that become necessary. Essentially, the result was a rubber stamp from the Kennedy administration on the eventual assassination of No Dinh Diem by rival elements in the Republic of Vietnam's military. In the case of LBJ's foreign policy legacy, following upon the foreign policy legacy of JFK, besides Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which are obvious issues connected to the Second Indochina War, you have the Goulard's regime replacement by the Branco regime in 1964 in Brazil. You also have contestation between Cabral and Gavino in the Dominican Republic in 1965, and the contestation and eventual replacement of Suharto and Sukarno in 1965 to 1967 in Indonesia. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson here on the right-hand side of the slide listens to tape sent by Captain Charles Robb from Vietnam in 1968. You can see his distress. Now, in the case of Brazil, you're already familiar with the U.S. backing in that conflict, but it is notable that the United States sent U.S. Navy and air support just off of the coast of Brazil while the coup was taking place in order to back Branco just in case the coup d'etat failed. In the Dominican Civil War, a junta led by President Josef Donald Reed Cabral was battling a constitutionalist or rebel forces who advocated for restoring to power the Dominican Republic's first ever democratically elected president, President Juan Emilio Bosch Gavino, whose term had been cut short by a previous coup. In response, the United States claimed that one of the sides was communist and launched Operation Power Pack, a U.S. military operation to impose the military between the rebels and the junta's forces to prevent a rebel advance, claiming that the rebels were a potential communist threat and possibly staving off a rebel victory. Most civilian advisors had recommended against immediate intervention in 1965, hoping that the junta could bring an end to the Civil War, but U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson took the advice of his ambassador in Santo Domingo, William Tapley Bennett, who suggested that the U.S. intervene. Chief of Staff General Wheeler told a subordinate, "Your unannounced mission is to prevent the Dominican Republic from going communist," and hence a fleet of 41 U.S. vessels was sent to blockade the island as the U.S. directly invaded. Ultimately, 42,000 soldiers and Marines were ordered into the Dominican Republic, and the U.S. occupied the country. Junior Army officers in Indonesia and the command of the Palace Guard, President Sukarno, had been collaborating with the CIA throughout the 1960s in another case. They accused senior Indonesian military brass of planning a CIA-backed coup against President Sukarno, and then they killed 6 senior generals on October 1st of 1965. General Muhammad Suharto and other senior military officers attacked junior officers on the same day, accusing the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI, of orchestrating the killing of the 6 generals. The army launched a propaganda campaign based on lies and riled up civilian mobs to attack those believed to be PKI supporters and other political opponents, resulting eventually in the Indonesian genocide from 1965 to 1967, which had U.S. military backing for the Indonesian military the entire time. Indonesian government forces, with collaboration of some civilians, perpetrated mass killings over a series of 2 years. The CIA has since acknowledged that, quote, in terms, the number of people killed in the anti-PKI massacres in Indonesia rank as one of the worst mass atrocity murders of the 20th century. End quote. That is even according to internal intelligence estimates. Estimates of the number of civilians dead have been rather conservative, ranging from 500,000 to 1 million, but more recent estimates put the figure between 2 and 3 million, now that all of the evidence is gradually being uncovered. Nonetheless, U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green has encouraged the military leaders to act forcefully at the time against political opponents. In 2017, declassified documents from the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta confirmed that the United States had detailed ongoing knowledge of the mass killings and actively facilitated and encouraged them for the sake of U.S. geopolitical interests. U.S. diplomats admitted to the circumstance and admitted to journalist Kathy Kadane in 1990 that they had provided the Indonesian army with thousands of names of alleged PKI supporters and other alleged leftists. President Sukarno's base of support was largely annihilated, imprisoned, and the remainder terrified. Thus, he was forced out of power in 1967, replaced by an authoritarian military regime led by General Suharto, which would rule Indonesia for the next 3 decades until it was brought down in the 1990s by a mass student-led pro-democracy movement.